Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
The podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host, Elijah Nichols.
And Addison Moore.
From DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today we'll be discussing colonialism, state-sanctioned violence, and the fight to end oppression of all forms with Marysol Fernandez-Harvey. Welcome, Marysol.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So how about you give us a short introduction about who you are, the work you do, and anything else that you want the viewers to know?
So my name is Marysol Fernandez-Harvey. I was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I'm right now just finishing my third year of undergraduate studies at Brown University. Over the last few years, I have manifested my resistance through writing and have worked as a staff columnist at the Brown Daily Herald with a special focus on Puerto Rican issues, Latin American issues, struggles surrounding the Latinx diaspora in the United States, as well as on colonialism, imperialism, and sort of the dangers and violence of U.S. interventionism around the world. Additionally, I have written a series of creative pieces having to do with the collective trauma that Puerto Rico has experienced in the post-Hurricane Maria period, as well as through the political mobilizations of this summer. Beyond writing, I'm pursuing a degree in economics and will be utilizing sort of those expertise to deal with the fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico and the ways that it has cost the livelihoods of so many Puerto Ricans on the island. More generally, I have a dedication to grassroots movements and hope to continue my work as an agitator and an organizer throughout the next several years as Puerto Rico continues to imagine new ways of politically and socially organizing itself. After graduation, I hope to be back in Puerto Rico and continue to participate in this revolutionary moment. And sort of my end goal for me is to drive a movement for a process of constitutional assemblies in what I hope will be sort of a radically participatory process of self-determination after what really has been, centuries of colonial exploitation.
Thank you so much for the work that you do. So the way that we want to go about this conversation, and we really want to have this be an open and honest discussion between all three of us, we wanted to start off with this sort of bigger question. Sort of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines colonialism as a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. However, we know this to be very vague and very similar to imperialism. We're just curious, would you agree with this definition? How would you expand upon it if you could?
I think, definitions of colonialism are particularly vague, and that really affects the way that we are able to talk about it and tackle it in both sort of the theoretical sphere, but also in our own actions and how we combat it. So I wouldn't disagree with the definition. I don't think it's wrong. Colonialism definitely has to do with domination, and it definitely has to do with the subjugations of peoples. But I would say it leaves out a lot, and that colonialism is a lot more pervasive than what the definition implies. And it has a lot more to do with sort of the active infiltration of a colonial external force into some of the most foundational parts of a quote unquote people or nation or, whatever we're going to call it. While the most identifiable indicator of colonialism certainly is sort of the subjugation of people, the lack of political sovereignty, I think really the fundamental part of it is that usurpation of the processes of nation building, of community building. And it is in those processes that colonialism really attacks and breaks apart what we might think of as a political or a social, a cultural, economic imagination of a people. And I think that's really what it gets at. And this definition sort of leaves that really fundamental part out of it. The other thing that I was thinking about in terms of this definition is it really also sort of leaves out the role of institutions in defining colonialism only as the subjugation of one people over another. Colonialism is not about bad people doing bad things, but it's about an entire infrastructure of institutions, whether that's the institution of capitalism, of racism, of intolerance, and all of these things that really go into the colonial process. And it goes beyond any individual person, but it also goes beyond just the idea of a collective person or personhood.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So thinking of institutions, the Not My Generation team, we often talk about the historical significance of state-sanctioned violence by Western colonizers on peoples and how this has been recreated throughout varying institutions today. So, how is the history of colonialism and its modern day forms affecting the livelihoods of the Puerto Rican people?
Colonialism is really at the center of every single struggle against oppression in Puerto Rico right now. And I think that's true of, any people who find themselves under sort of that incredibly intrusive force of colonialism. And thinking about Puerto Rico in particular, we think about the struggle against economic exploitation and how it's directly connected to colonialism and the ways that US corporate interests have been allowed to come into the island and make of it what they want. It's connected to the labor struggle and the ways that more oppressive labor laws, lower minimum wages, and fewer welfare benefits are given to Puerto Rican workers because Puerto Rican workers are thought of primarily and defined as workers within a colony and therefore less deserving of protections and benefits, right? Political corruption, poverty, crime, these are all intertwined with colonialism in very fundamental ways and affects the livelihoods of Puerto Ricans just all throughout all aspects of life. And it really is sort of that colonial monster that needs to be addressed in order to work towards any kind of justice and any kind of liberation in Puerto Rico. It is sort of like the thing that's at the center of it, but it's very difficult in terms of the way that politics run, because although it's at the center of everything, it's something that Puerto Ricans actually don't have a say on, and they don't have ways and mechanisms to affect that structure directly. And so you can't vote away colonial policies because that's just the nature of what having a lack of self-determination is.
So when you say we can't, or the Puerto Rican people can't vote away these colonial institutions, they can't vote away these colonialist politicians, what are you suggesting that individuals in Puerto Rico should do, or individuals like yourself should be doing in this fight for liberation of Puerto Ricans?
Right. So I think because there aren't mechanisms in place for that to happen, it really needs to happen at sort of this grassroots level, as we might think of many political movements needing to happen that way, because a lot of the times what we are fighting and what we are struggling against are institutions that perpetuate oppression of marginalized identities. And it is exactly those that we're fighting against. And so we can't use sort of traditional mechanisms of just voting out things when we're addressing them. And so I think currently in Puerto Rico, we've seen sort of a uptick in political manifestations. And unfortunately, that is a product of increased desolation and disillusionment with institutions in Puerto Rico that you're seeing, from the acquisition of illegal and unpayable debt to the undemocratically imposed fiscal control board on Puerto Rico, to the totally inept and terrible response from the US government to Hurricane Maria's disaster. I mean, all of these things have really been building up, and I think you've seen an uptick in political manifestations in Puerto Rico, and I think that's the way the movement needs to be going. Additionally to that, we need people who have the expertise and have the time and have the space to be able to dedicate their lives to this sort of struggle. And I think that's what I'm hoping to do. And I think a lot of people of our generation are hoping to do that in Puerto Rico. And so it's a really exciting moment right now. But I do think there is so much to be done. It feels very daunting at times.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like an incredibly daunting task. And I feel like, especially in the US, this is something that so many people are struggling with right now, whether it's indigenous folks within the states, whether it's Black individuals, whether it's queer individuals, and this mindset of being oppressed and the systems of oppression that we have, like you mentioned, systems of capitalism that reinforce big corporations coming and exploiting laborers, and US officials coming in and exploiting land, exploiting the property of Puerto Rican people. And you mentioned how all of this is systematic and how it's reinforced through everything. And that's quite interesting because I feel like oftentimes we don't think about colonization as something so modern, so new, so in the times. It's not something that we've left behind. It's not like as soon as a bunch of white folks came in and said, oh, I guess we're not doing colonialism anymore. Instead, we're doing democracy now. And that's so interesting. And I wish we had that conversation more. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation right now about how it's not gone. It's how it's truly pervasive right now in these times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are so many ways that this sort of historical legacy of colonialism, of, state-sanctioned violence in particular, has really played into the way that the power dynamics play out today. And I'll focus again on the case of Puerto Rico. During the 20th century, there was a very strict and active project on the part of the US government to repress any kind of independence movement and even any affiliation to that sort of sentiment. We're talking about gag laws. We're talking about files that were kept of people who were either very directly involved in the nationalist movement in the 20th century or just affiliates of people who were involved. I mean, we have over, 100,000 files on Puerto Ricans from that time holding really intimate information about people and exhibiting sort of a long history of decades of surveillance that was illegal. And so you have all these things, a bunch of just very violent events, massacres of protests. And all of this plays into sort of the ways that independence movements and the independence sentiment has become very taboo in Puerto Rico. And, in recent elections, you have the Independence Party receiving 3% of the vote in the governmental elections. And that's a really different reality than what was happening in the 1900s, And that has to do with sort of that project of creating fear within the Puerto Rican psyche, within the Puerto Rican personhood about, I don't want to be part of this independence movement because it's dangerous for me to be that. And I think that's a really important legacy and a really important way that, the systems of state-sanctioned violence have really played into what people think is politically imaginable today. And I think that's a really important part of it too. Also, in a lot of cases, we're really quick to call out the violence of some and really slow to call out the violence of others. And I think that's really central. We had this experience, again, in the 20th century, we had the attack on Congress by Puerto Rican nationalists, right? And those Puerto Rican nationalists really were trying to call attention to the Puerto Rican question as it was beginning to come out of sort of international discourse, people thinking, Puerto Rico's not a colony anymore, it's fine now, and really wanting to combat that effort. And then you have that kind of violence being blown out of proportion and used to justify these methods of state-sanctioned violence. And you see it so much even today. I mean, during the 2019 political protests in Puerto Rico, what you saw was a movement that began very non-militarized. And you had these massive protests where people went with their families, people went with their children, old folks went, and it was really a bringing together of a nation in a very non-militarized way. But it was met with militarized force by the police, getting hit with batons, getting shot with BB guns, getting thrown tear gas. And there was even cases of the police sending people to infiltrate the protests dressed as protesters to instigate in order for the police force to have a reason to justify their violence. And I think this sort of double standard that we have for, violence on the part of people who are really working to fight oppression and who feel so desperate that they feel this is the only mechanism for them versus the violence that is just reinforced cycle after cycle by these systems,
And I think that plays so directly into sort of the gun violence prevention movement at large, internationally, around the world, because we're seeing states exploiting individuals, whether it's Puerto Rican individuals, whether it's Black and brown individuals in the States, whether it's undocumented individuals in the States, and using mechanisms of violence like the police force, like ICE, to break apart communities, to strip down people to feel as if they're less than a person. And it's absolutely abhorrent. And I think that's something that the gun violence prevention movement truly needs to understand, truly needs to get, that it's about tackling these systems of violence that we have. It's not like it's just within our communities, it's within our systems, like we've repeated so many times throughout this episode.
Absolutely. I mean, in Puerto Rico, what you've seen is really just a history of colonialism. It's been centuries. We really have not had a moment of independence since the, Spanish came in the 1400s. And so that plays a huge role. Actually, in my participation in the sort of political movements this summer, one of my signs that I brought to the protest read, "Today we decolonize minds, tomorrow we break chains." And I think that was really a huge part of the movement where you saw people beginning to say, oh my God, we've been living for this for so long and it really is becoming unacceptable. And again, that's a product of the fact that we lost thousands of people during Hurricane Maria because of the colonial situation. Hurricane Maria begun by a natural disaster, but it really was a man-made disaster. And it was the disaster of colonialism that really caused that many lives, right? But for example, during the movements too, it began as this collective movement of all Puerto Ricans. But as soon as the Puerto Rican police forces began to meet with such force, a lot of Puerto Ricans began to pull back. It was sort of those collective memories of violence against the independence movement that were starting to bubble up again. People would actually call out the more radicalized protesters, a lot of university students, a lot of activists from independence organizations who were getting up there and standing in front of the police force, hooded and with masks in order to protect themselves from the tear gas. Those people were called out and criticized a lot by the Puerto Rican public as instigators. Of course, I think that really comes from the colonized mind and this idea that, oh, we can't be instigating. This is not what our movement is about, without a recognition of the ways that the institutionalized forces have been instigating. They were really the instigators of that kind of conflict. And so that plays a huge role. And again, thinking of 3% voting for an independence party in recent elections. And I think it is beginning to change, but there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of, decolonizing the minds of the Puerto Rican people.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that gun violence prevention organizers need to take home with themselves. Like we've repeated time and time again, like this is systemic, this is historical, and that we have to stand up in a way that individuals feel uncomfortable, that the larger populace feels uncomfortable, so they can see the horrific actions that police forces, that systems of injustice, they do for marginalized folks. This has kind of got me thinking, though, because I feel as if within the states, from individuals who have lived their life here, there's a different conversation going about. Specifically in leftist circles, some individuals say, oh, give them statehood. Some individuals say, give them liberation. Some individuals say, leave them where they are. But I'm really curious, as someone who grew up, lived in Puerto Rico, what is your mindset on that, about this larger debate within the states and giving true autonomy to Puerto Rican people?
That's an incredibly huge question. Again, the status question is at the center of everything in Puerto Rico, but is also something that is very divisive. Our political spectrum really is divided between the statehood party versus the kind of situation that we have right now where we're connected to the US, but not a state, that kind of party, and then the independence party. And there are other things, but really that's what defines. And really those two first parties that I talked about dominate the political world in Puerto Rico. And so that's really at the center. And it's a great question. For me, I feel as though Puerto Ricans identify themselves as a nation that is different from the United States. I think culturally, we're a very nationalistic people. We will, throw our flag everywhere, and we're very proud of our Puerto Ricanhood. And I think a lot of our inability to believe in the possibility of an independent future has to do with what we were just talking about the colonized mind. I personally will be advocating for an independence movement, and I think that needs to be one that is smart. I don't think it would be fair at all or good for the Puerto Rican people to just be left independent now. We have all these problems right now that are really due to colonialism, and any kind of independence process would need to sort of take into account that those are things that will continue to exist. And how do we get to a point slowly and with phases of self-sufficiency and self-determination? So that's one thing. But in terms of my personal sort of career goals and like what I want to be doing in Puerto Rico, really has more to do of a process of self-determination. And so my work is not intended to be advocacy for independence. It's more advocacy of, I want a participatory process for the Puerto Rican people, and whatever comes out of that process, I will advocate for that. And so that's sort of what's on my mind right now, because whether it's independence, whether it's statehood, whether it's something else, it really needs to come from the Puerto Rican people, and they have not been given that opportunity really in their history.
You've talked a bit about like how the people have like really stood up and really challenged these systems. How has colonialism ingrained itself into the culture in a way that has some folks who may feel resistant and maybe feel a little bit worried about challenging the system that they're kind of used to interacting with and have a history of interacting with?
I think both tackling colonialism and tackling the gun violence epidemic in the United States really is about a fight for justice, about a refusal to consent or to participate in oppressive systems. And it's about mobilization and it's about action. And I think what connects the fight against colonialism to the fight against gun violence, even beyond that, which is something that I think connects a lot of our fights against any kind of system of oppression, particular to these two, is sort of the way that violence has been used as a mechanism to instill fear in peoples in a way that will continue to perpetuate the oppression of these systems. And I think that's really the key that really, connects both of these. And I've been super inspired by Not My Generation's work and the ways that you guys have really foregrounded intersectionality in your work, and sort of thinking about there are lots of things that define a difference between your struggle and the next person's struggle, but they're really connected in the ways that, it's a struggle against oppression and the systems of oppression, and whether that's manifested in the persecution of Puerto Rican nationalists or the murder of Black and brown bodies across this nation. It's about that, fight against systems of oppression.
So sort of like we talked about just a second ago, we really know that anti-imperialist movements, anti-colonialist efforts, they're often seen separate from the gun violence prevention movement. I think how you explained it, the connections between state-sanctioned violence with the fight to end colonialism and how that's tied in the gun violence prevention movement. But I'm kind of curious, what was your initial thought when Not My Generation, a gun violence prevention organization, reached out to you to be on this episode and to talk about colonialism and how it's connected to gun violence prevention?
When Catherine first reached out to me, I was surprised and curious. I wasn't so familiar with the work that Not My Generation was doing, and I was unsure of the ways that my work would sort of intersect with the organization's missions and purpose, and what you guys were trying to do with this kind of podcast and this kind of work, right? But after sort of just a very preliminary Google search, I began to see the ways that, again, you guys foreground intersectionality and how that's so central to the work, and I thought it was super exciting to be invited to participate in that work. So super appreciative. And I think we're talking about fights against oppression, and I think they're parallel fights, whether, it's the fight against the gun violence epidemic in the United States or a fight against Puerto Rico's colonial struggle. And it really, to me, is about taking advantage of the possibility of these sort of radical confluences and practicing radical empathy and practicing radical love. And these things are made radical by the fact that, like the institutions have done so much work to limit what we think is politically or socially imaginable, the institutions of oppression have also done a lot of work to sort of define how we are able to relate to each other and to create these arbitrary lines between one struggle and the other struggle, right? And I think in practicing sort of this radical solidarity, which is so central to the work that you guys are doing, and so central to, I think, the work that Puerto Rico is doing. And I think in Puerto Rico's case, we really need to be sort of foregrounding and putting that more to the center of the discussion. I think that's really where we locate the possibilities for change.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your kind comments about Not My Generation. It's good to know that we're being recognized for our intentionality and everything that we do. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it's something that the fight against colonialism needs to be talking about more, really. I see it in Puerto Rico, even within revolutionary circles, where you see a lot of racism and you see a lot of sexism and you see a lot of intolerance of other people who really are fighting against oppression in very similar ways. And the fight for liberation really has no space for that. I mean, it needs to be inclusive and diversive and pro all of these different struggles, and we all need to be sort of collaborating on this, because the truth is that if we're able to think of these as parallel struggles, I mean, we are the majority against a minority ruling class, right? And that, mobilizing those numbers is so important to actually creating change, because there is so much concentration of power, but I think there's a lot of power in numbers too, and I think that's super important.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really smart and uplifting note to sort of end on. The idea that, yes, we're fighting against these oppressive systems, but with the numbers that come with mass movements, we can tear them down, we can take them down, and we can really bring justice for every single individual in the world, really, if we just build these mass movements. Thinking about this more positive ending note, I'm really curious if you have any words of hope for individuals who want to be in this fight to end colonialism and to get rid of the injustices that it brings.
I think it's a lot about the ways that we narrate and the ways that we imagine colonialism. I mean, you pointed at it. I think a lot of times we talk about living in a post-colonial era and being able to say that while Puerto Rico and so many other places. I mean, Puerto Rico's not by any means the only place that's living a colonial reality, but talking about a post-colonial world when we're living all of these colonial situations is part of the problem. Talking about, the celebration of a globalized sort of world that, yes, you can connect with people more, but it also means that mechanisms of oppression become more far reaching too. Talking about the celebration of free trade instead of thinking about fair trade and the way that has perpetrated legacies of labor exploitation around the world. I mean, there are just so many ways that we narrate our current world that really leave out a lot of these struggles, and I think that's a huge part of it. And then I'll do my little plug that I always say to people in the United States. In the case of Puerto Rico in particular, it's like whether or not you are actively voting for Puerto Rico, when you participate in politics here in the United States, you are voting for Puerto Rico because Congress and the executive branch of the U.S. government, they are the sovereigns over Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans do not have the right to vote for them. And so really it is, I think, a responsibility of people who are in the United States to take that into account, because you're doing it whether you think you are or you're not. And so I think that's really important in talking about this specific case.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to tie up how people in the states, whether they're gun violence prevention organizers or not, they have a stake in this all. They are actively making changes in the Puerto Rican lives, individuals in the Middle East, individuals within their own backyard. Each vote that we cast, it tackles some of these issues, whether we know it or not, and whether we like to admit it or not. So really looking at elected officials and holding them accountable for their thoughts and their voting record, really, on imperialistic and colonialistic efforts that the U.S. government either supports or directly does. So thank you so much, Marysol, for coming on, to taking the time to speak with us about this important topic, about colonialism, about injustices, about oppression in all forms, really. We hope to have you back possibly someday, and we're very grateful. So thank you so much.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I will definitely be looking out for things that you guys are doing. Again, I just am so impressed and blown away by y'all's work, and I really, appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to episode 4 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast, where we discuss colonialism, state-sanctioned violence, and the fight to end oppression of all forms with Marysol. Please join us next Tuesday for an episode on pride, resilience, and LGBTQ+ advocacy.
In solidarity, Elijah Nichols,
Addison Moore,
and Marysol Fernandez-Harvey.